The moment security escorted a black woman out of the five-star restaurant, staff thought they dealt with another problem guest. They didn't know they just humiliated the CEO behind the $3 billion fund, keeping their entire chain afloat. What started as racial discrimination in 48 hours made an entire empire collapse. It was a chilly spring night in Chicago, and the facade of the St. James Grill shimmered under the city lights like a promise of exclusivity. The mirrored glass, the gold-trimmed awning, and the deep red carpet formed the gateway to a world where few were welcome, or so they thought. Luxury cars lined up silently at the curb, and valets in black gloves handled keys like they were crown jewels. Inside, the scent of truffles and expensive wine wafted through the dining rooms. This was a place built to impress, and Celeste Morgan knew exactly what she was walking into. She wore a tailored black suit, the structured blazer stark against her skin, commanding attention in a space that thrived on restraint. Her walk was poised, understated, like someone who didn't need to prove a thing. In her hand, a minimalist clutch held a single piece of paper, a confirmed reservation for two in her name. But even before she reached the hostess stand, the scene had been judged. Two white security guards stepped forward, a living barricade. "This place is for people with real reservations, ma'am," the first one said, the word real laced with a sharpness that cut like a blade. The second just stared, his eyes scanning her from her hair to her shoes, as if her skin color nullified any proof she might offer. There was no check of her ID, no greeting, just a snap judgment that a black woman alone, well-dressed and too calm, had to be lying. Celeste took a deep breath. She didn't argue. She simply started to open her clutch to show the paper, but even that small gesture wasn't allowed. The second guard took a step closer, as if bracing for something dangerous. Not from the clutch, but from what she represented. They weren't there to protect the restaurant from threats. They were there to protect it from people like her. It wasn't in any handbook, but it was clear in their eyes. Around them, no one stepped in. The dining room, steeped in discretion, played the role of silent accomplice. Linen-draped tables stood untouched, silverware clinking softly against porcelain. But Celeste wasn't being welcomed. She was being blocked, not for lack of a reservation, but because of the color of her skin. The embarrassment was deliberate, the humiliation calculated, and yet she stood there, unmoving, just watching. The first guard crossed his arms. The second, growing impatient, made a subtle gesture for her to step back. "You leaving on your own?" he muttered, his body leaning slightly forward, a warning on the verge of action. It wasn't a question, it was a polished threat. The room, so quiet, seemed to hold its breath. In that split second, Celeste had to decide, give in or stand her ground. And she stood her ground with what she had, dignity. Her posture stayed tall, her eyes steady, her hands still reaching for the paper. But there was no time. The men had already decided she didn't even deserve an explanation. This wasn't a mistake anymore. It was a symbolic execution. What should have been a triumphant entrance became the prelude to a forced exit. She didn't yell, didn't cry. She simply held the one thing the guards couldn't handle, composure. The way she refused to beg for acceptance stung more than any retort, and that's exactly why they moved. The first guard took a final step forward. The second closed in from behind. The sound of her blazer being tugged was the signal that prejudice had just won, for now. No one in the room knew who Celeste Morgan was, and maybe that was the real issue. She was too powerful to be ignored, but too black to be acknowledged. In trying to erase her presence, the restaurant had just sparked a silent fire, one that would start burning the moment they laid hands on her. The touch came fast, firm, without hesitation. Celeste's left arm was grabbed tightly. The second guard boxed her in from the other side, gripping her firmly while saying, "You're leaving, ma'am." She didn't even get a chance to speak. No chance to show the reservation. This wasn't an escort, it was a takedown. And the dining room watched with cold detachment, knowing exactly what was happening. Her steps faltered on the marble floor as the men dragged her toward the exit without finesse. Her clutch nearly slipped as she tried to grab her phone to make a call. Her blazer twisted at the shoulder. No one offered help. No manager appeared. It was as if this problem had to be removed quickly before anyone important noticed, or worse, cared. The violence was quiet but public, a message disguised as procedure. Celeste tried to stay upright, but the Yanks threw off her elegance. Her presence was now just a body to be removed, not a guest to be served. The restaurant no longer saw her outfit, her poise, or her reservation. It saw only her skin, and as much as she tried to stay calm, what hurt most was knowing they knew what they were doing, and did it anyway. When the revolving door closed behind her, the guards let go with casual disregard. One adjusted his suit and muttered smugly, "There we go." The phrase was small but carried centuries of exclusion. This wasn't about the restaurant. It was about the thrill of power that comes from denying space to someone who's always had to fight twice as hard for everything. Celeste smoothed her hair, saying nothing. Not yet. The cold night air brushed her wrists, now marked from the unnecessary force. The neon sign glowed behind her like an insult. Luxury for the few, respect for even fewer. Her phone had fallen to the ground, its cracked screen reflecting the same shards now forming her restrained anger. But there was no shouting, no scene. Celeste just stepped away and sat on the nearest bench. The St. James facade looked untouched, but inside it was already fracturing. While diners ate on, oblivious to what they'd witnessed, Celeste opened her phone and found a single contact. Her fingers didn't waver. She didn't need to raise her voice. She just needed to give a command. And that command was ready. Because when you bankroll an empire, punishment is just a matter of choice. She waited for the call to connect, staring straight at the guards still stationed at the door. One was chuckling quietly. The other watched her with disdain, as if he'd won. Celeste, phone to her ear, held her gaze steady. Activate the full withdrawal clause. 3 billion. Today. The words came out flat. Not vengeance, but strategic justice. The response was swift. Yes, Ms. Morgan. And in that moment, this was no longer about a denied dinner. It was about the imminent collapse of an entire network. Their shove would turn into an avalanche, a shock wave that would start small and swallow everything without warning. They'd force Celeste out, but she'd wipe them off the map with a single tap. Phone still in hand, Celeste stayed seated, watching. The restaurant hummed along, unaware of what was stirring behind the scenes. But inside she was different. What would happen here wasn't an end, it was a trigger. And on that sidewalk under the yellow streetlight and the city's complicit silence, the precise response of someone who never needed to shout to topple entire structures was born. The cold touched her skin, but inside she felt something else, a quiet heat of conviction. She didn't need to move fast, didn't need to leave. She was exactly where she wanted to be, at the center of the impact. What had been done was done. Now the rest would come in time. She stood slowly, adjusting her sleeves as if donning her own authority. The black blazer was still pristine, but its meaning had shifted. No longer a guest attire, it was the armor of decision. Every step she took was deliberate, as if staking a claim. She moved lightly, but the ground seemed to tremble beneath her. To an outsider, she was just a woman walking away. But the restaurant's foundation was already shaking. Celeste didn't look back right away. She passed under the awning, crossed part of the sidewalk, and only then paused. She turned facing the St. James grill sign with an unreadable expression. No anger, just observation, like someone who no longer sees a place, but a symptom. She knew she wasn't the first. She also knew she'd be the last to be treated like that here. She moved to a side awning, out of the entryway's flow. She sat again, crossed her legs calmly, and unlocked her phone. No notifications yet, but she didn't need confirmation. She knew the gears she'd set in motion. The structure she'd helped build was the same one now starting to crumble, not by chance, by choice. And all she had to do now was watch, with purpose. The facade gleamed, waiters still circled, and diners kept smiling. But there on the street corner was the woman who'd put it all in check without raising her voice. Her presence still unsettled even from outside, because she didn't react the way they expected. She didn't scream, didn't lose control. And that strategic calm was what threatened them most. The damage would start right there, in the silence. Eyes fixed on the restaurant, Celeste reflected quietly. The city moved on, but something had shifted irreversibly. She didn't need to be recognized inside. They'd already lost far more than a guest. they'd lose their very foundation. And in that exact moment, while no one noticed, Celeste Morgan went from a barred body to the force that would dismantle it all from within. Celeste Morgan wasn't just a powerful woman, she was the invisible force behind dozens of luxury brands that, on the surface, seemed independent, but underneath, relied on her to survive. St. James Hospitality, the group behind the restaurant chain that had just tried to erase her from its doorstep, was deeply tied to her company, Vanguard Crest Capital. It was Celeste who'd greenlit their latest international credit lines, secured their insurance, and orchestrated their mergers. Without her, the machine stopped. But that night, Celeste wasn't there as an investor or a CEO. She was there as a guest, a Black woman personally testing a tip she'd received weeks earlier. A pattern of structural racism across the chain's locations, cloaked in the guise of exclusivity. She didn't send auditors. She didn't warn anyone. She went herself, because some truths only hit when you feel them firsthand. The visit to the St. James Grill wasn't random. It was the darling of media praise and the target of hushed complaints. And what she experienced there, in under 3 minutes, confirmed what she'd suspected. The prejudice wasn't a fluke, it was routine. The way the guards moved, the speed of their judgment, the lack of any verification. It all spoke louder than reports. It spoke of culture, and culture has roots or gets cut at the root. Celeste didn't need more evidence. She had the security footage. She had the financial reports, the internal complaints, the unfiled testimonies. But now she had the most important thing, the lived truth. And that changed everything. Because when a woman like her is humiliated and chooses to act, the impact doesn't come in memos. It comes in silent earthquakes only those with wallets can hear. On that cold sidewalk, it wasn't just a woman hurt by injustice. It was the architect of an empire's fall, one that insisted on ignoring the real world. From that moment, the investigation was no longer confidential. The response was no longer technical. Celeste Morgan wouldn't react as a victim. She'd act as the ultimate authority. And those who laughed at her inside the restaurant, they were about to learn the cost. Minutes after Celeste was removed, the two guards slipped back inside, chuckling under their breath, like they just played a bit part in a cruel skit. One mimicked her attempt to show the reservation, folding his arms theatrically. "Thought a fancy blazer changed anything?" he whispered to the other, dripping with scorn. His colleague laughed, shaking his head. "She should have known this ain't her kind of place." Farther back, a passing waiter overheard and looked away. He was used to those kinds of remarks. He'd seen this before, but it was easier to ignore. The prejudice here wasn't an outlier. It was the culture. It lived in the inside jokes, the coded nicknames in the system, the tone of the training sessions. It didn't need to be said aloud to be part of the air. But that night, the arrogance crossed the line of disguise. The hostess, who'd pretended not to see the scene, typed at her station like nothing had happened. But between clicks, she let slip. She thought acting all poised would get her past house rules. Another staffer laughed, eyes down. It was just another day. The disdain here was as common as the wine poured at the tables. And the subtler it was, the more it was protected. What they didn't know was that everything was being recorded. The lobby cameras, motion activated, caught the expressions, the words, the gestures, even the guard's muffled laugh as he knocked Celeste's phone back into her clutch, even the narrowed eyes of contempt at her skin. None of them imagined that this night, just another blocked guest to them, was in fact their downfall documented in real time. St. James prided itself on its veneer of luxury and discretion, but peek behind the curtain and the shine was just a front. The poison wasn't just in the actions, but in the system, and that system had mocked the wrong woman. Every laugh inside wasn't just an insult, it was evidence, and that evidence, quietly stored, would soon reach the world. The next morning, the Vanguard Crest Capital office in Manhattan operated with surgical silence. No public statements, no fanfare. But internally, every department got direct orders. Top priority directives triggered clauses for immediate fund cuts. The machine propping up part of the St. James Empire started to seize, without even knowing why. First move, freeze international credit flows. Then, suspend logistics insurance and block renewals with key suppliers. In under 6 hours, meetings were canceled, mergers reassessed, campaigns paused. The holding company running the chain got no explanations, just legal notices with cold phrasing. Breach of institutional principles. It was like cutting oxygen to a body still breathing. Luxury travel agencies tied to Vanguard were told to drop packages involving any St. James location. At the same time, media and advertising contracts had their sponsorship clauses terminated. Strategic partners started calling, confused, asking if there was an internal crisis. But there was no crisis. There was consequence, and no one at the top seemed to grasp where it was coming from. Meanwhile, Vanguard's own compliance team formed a new investigative committee, not to probe the incident, but to organize the evidence already collected. It was time to act not as a victim, but as a manager. Celeste didn't want public apologies or sympathy notes. She wanted real change, and she knew structures only reform when they fear collapse. Early internal reports showed the ripple effect of the cancellations. St. James locations in New York, Miami, and London were already facing delayed deliveries and supplier alerts. Corporate guests, informed of the Vanguard partnership break, started canceling stays. The reservation system, once overloaded, was now quiet. A silence that screamed. Most alarming was the halt of a $200 million Middle East expansion, blocked that same day for lack of Vanguard's approval. Celeste hadn't cut the funding out of spite. It was about principles. The corporate world would get the message without needing a scandal. St. James wasn't just being punished, it was being abandoned. And while directors scrambled to understand what had changed, the gears kept turning. Only now in reverse. What was once growth became contraction. What was once prestige became uncertainty. And at the center of it all was the name of a woman they'd chosen to ignore. But now she alone decided the fate of every brick in their chain. At 9:14 a.m., Gabriel Wilcox's phone rang with the urgency few dared to wield. It was the holding company's general counsel, her voice firm and direct. "Gabriel, we had a serious incident last night. Ms. Celeste Morgan was barred from one of our locations." The silence that followed was heavy. He knew that name, and he knew instantly that something irreversible had begun. "You said Celeste Morgan," he repeated, as if the name alone had punched him in the gut. The counsel confirmed. "Yes, she was blocked at the St. James Grill in Chicago. 2 guards, didn't check her reservation, didn't listen." Gabriel didn't need more details. Celeste wasn't just an investor. She was the investor, the woman quietly holding up the group's backbone. He stood, cold sweat beating at his temples. This wasn't an incident. It was a verdict. Celeste Morgan could pull billions with an email, a call, a single choice, and she wasn't driven by impulse. If she'd acted, it was already planned. There'd be no time for apologies. What had been broken wasn't just a relationship, it was the foundation of their survival. As he listened to the details from the security footage, Gabriel couldn't ease the tension in his shoulders. "They touched her?" he asked. The answer was blunt, hard, and laughed after. The CEO pushed papers off his desk with restrained fury. This wasn't just an operational error, it was an institutional disaster, and ironically caused by the arrogance of those who thought no one important looked like her. After the call, Gabriel didn't summon the board. He didn't call marketing. He stood silent, staring out at Manhattan's muted skyline. He knew that soon, they wouldn't just be talking about plummeting stocks or lost contracts. They'd be debating the legitimacy of the brand itself. And at the heart of the wreckage would be her name. Not out of revenge, but as a response. 2 days later, a former St. James employee posted on X. They thought she was just another one, until they found out she held the keys. The raw, simple line blew up. Within an hour, the post racked up thousands of likes, retweets, and comments. The story started taking shape publicly, not through PR but through collective outrage. And the question echoed, how did this happen to her? Influencers began amplifying the case, sharing clips of the security footage already circulating in private groups. The moment Celeste is grabbed, her failed attempt to show the reservation, her phone shoved back into her clutch. No edits, no captions, just the raw facts, and the humiliation laid bare. The internet did what the institution wouldn't. It named the racism. Investigative outlets started digging, and what they found was a pattern across multiple St. James locations. Black women ignored, blocked, or escorted out despite confirmed reservations. Stories began surfacing like old scars finally given space. St. James wasn't an outlier, it was a mirror, and Celeste had forced the world to look into it. Curiously, Celeste Morgan hadn't spoken publicly. No statement, no interview, no video, but her silence amplified her presence. It wasn't omission, it was strategy. Real power doesn't rush to explain itself. She'd already said everything with one phone call. Now she let the world fill in the rest. On the streets, Celeste became more than a CEO. She became a symbol, a voice, a reflection of millions. What was done to her, so many others had felt, but without the same tools to respond. The country now watched, outraged, as an empire crumbled, not by rumor, by evidence. And Celeste Morgan's name began to mean something far greater than capital: silent justice through action. The viral security footage was the spark that ignited it all. Black influencers, entrepreneurs, and artists began coordinating. "If she can't walk in, we don't either," said a tech mogul's video, racking up millions of views in hours. Celebrities joined in. The boycott of St. James went from hashtag to collective action. Luxury travel agencies announced immediate cuts to packages tied to the chain. "Our clients won't pay to be treated with contempt," read a statement from a major Florida operator. Corporate events were canceled in waves. Brands sponsoring exclusive St. James experiences pulled out within days. It was a domino effect, and each piece fell faster. The cancellations didn't just come from activists or the general public. They came from the elite clientele the chain had courted for years. Top executives, cultural producers, influential journalists, those who'd paid premium prices for service now turned away. Not for savings, but for conscience. And that kind of loss was the hardest to recover, the symbolic one. In 4 days, bookings dropped 70% at locations like New York, Los Angeles, and Paris. The holding company's stock fell 18%. Investors demanded emergency meetings. The image of sophistication, once the brand's pride, now stood for exclusion. This wasn't about one incident anymore. It was about a system of prejudice laid bare, sustained by silence, until it was too late. Behind the scenes, the chain's marketing team scrambled for responses, but every crisis control attempt was met with online sarcasm. "You fired the wrong door," read a viral comment. The line captured the public sentiment. This wasn't about guards. It was about the system, and firing a few pieces wasn't enough. The public wanted change or ruin. Celeste stayed silent, but every new headline seemed to shout for her. The restaurant that rejected her was now rejected by a nation. And ironically, the more they tried to defend themselves, the more they exposed the gap between their words and their actions. The boycott wasn't a trend, it was a stance. And this time, it hit where it hurt most. The top of the social pyramid St. James claimed to serve. On a gray Monday afternoon, St. James's top shareholders were summoned to an urgent video call. The mood was contained panic. Plunging stocks, investors pulling out, PR teams overwhelmed. No one knew what to expect, but her name was on the agenda, Celeste Morgan. And when her face appeared on screen, the virtual room fell dead silent. Celeste appeared with her usual composure. Black blazer, calm face, upright posture. She didn't smile, didn't greet anyone. She just clicked to share her screen and press play. The video was stark. The guards yanking her arm, blocking her call, laughing after. No narration, no captions, just the facts. Cruel, cold, documented. No one dared interrupt. When the video ended, Celeste faced the camera. Her voice came through for the first time, low and without anger. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated case. It was the perfect snapshot of a culture you've refused to see." The shareholders didn't know where to look. Some lowered their eyes, others froze. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't threatening. She was stating, with proof. The internal reports always existed. So did the complaints. But you chose to ignore them. Celeste paused, letting the weight of her words settle. And now you face the cost of your silence. There was no room for negotiation, no olive branch. This meeting wasn't an invitation to talk. It was a broken mirror. The screen stayed split for a few seconds, showing pale, restless faces with no answers. No one asked questions. No one offered apologies. Celeste's mere presence was answer enough. She knew, and worse, she'd already acted. All that was left was to deal with the fallout of choices made while they thought she was invisible. But invisible was something she'd never been. Celeste ended the call with a sharp click. No goodbyes, no statements. The system closed, but her presence lingered in every face in the room. Those men and women in suits and ties realized too late they weren't facing an angry guest. They were facing the woman who held the power they'd pretended to control and who no longer needed to prove a thing. The next morning, heads began to roll. The two guards involved were fired outright, with internal memos citing severe breach of professional conduct. The hostess from that night was also let go, with no public explanation. Memos circulated backstage like emergency bandages trying to stop an uncontrollable fire. But the problem wasn't individual anymore. The firings leaked to the press in minutes. Some outlets called it corrective action, others desperate reaction. In the comments, the public was blunt. Firings don't erase a racist system. Now they're fixing what they pretended not to see. St. James no longer controlled the story. Every attempt at correction felt like another chapter of denial, and that only fueled the anger. Pushed by outside investors and nervous board members, CEO Gabriel Wilcox announced a task force for institutional review. He promised independent audits, inclusion protocols, and cultural reassessment. But none of it felt believable. The damage didn't come from a lack of rules, but from complicity with those who broke them repeatedly. Now every promise sounded like a cry for help. Celeste watched from afar. No statement, no comment. She knew the firings weren't about justice, they were about fear. And above all, about image. They weren't sorry, they were cornered, and the world saw it. International headlines no longer framed the case as a one-off scandal. They framed it as a symptom of a system that needed more than cuts. It needed to be rebuilt. The footage, subtitled in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic, circled the globe. Talk shows in the US, panels in Europe, debates in African universities. The story outgrew the corporate drama. It became a symbol of something bigger, the end of silent tolerance. Celeste had touched an open wound, and St. James's hasty bandages only exposed what they tried to hide. Firing visible culprits didn't clean the stain. The stain was structural, and every new dismissal only strengthened Celeste's point. They always knew. The question now echoing in the streets, the markets, and the dining rooms was simple and brutal. If she wasn't who she is, what would have happened? The answer, everyone knew, and that changed everything. 2 weeks later, the St. James Grill seemed back to normal, at least on the surface. The facade was polished, staff underwent inclusion training, and the new guards greeted every guest with forced smiles. But the empty tables were glaring. The usual clientele had vanished. The brand, once a badge of exclusivity, was now a byword for exclusion. On a Friday night, Celeste Morgan returned. No warning, no reservation. She wore the same black blazer from that night, the same steady steps, the same minimalist clutch. She walked in like she no longer needed to prove anything. The new guard, a young man, visibly nervous, recognized her instantly. "Good evening, ma'am. Welcome," he said with an almost rehearsed bow. Celeste didn't respond. She kept walking, her heels clicking on the marble like the sound of a gavel. She glanced around. The walls were the same, but the air was different. The new hostess, seeing who just entered, froze. Behind the counter, a server with downcast eyes and hunched shoulders could barely breathe. It was the old hostess, now demoted. Her shame spoke louder than any apology. Celeste walked to the center of the dining room. She stopped. She took it all in for a few seconds. Her gaze was calm, almost analytical, like someone surveying the rubble of something still pretending to stand. No one approached. No one offered a menu. And yet she owned the room, not by declared authority, but by the authority felt. The woman they'd expelled was now impossible to ignore. Without a word, Celeste turned and left. Her steps stayed firm, but now carried something more, the certainty that the world had seen. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to sit. She didn't need to dine. Her mere presence there was a living reminder that power doesn't impose, it reveals. And in that restaurant, where they tried to erase her, it was now impossible to forget who she was. In your opinion, if she were a white woman, would she have been kicked out? And if it were you in her place, what would you have done? It's super important that you drop your comment. You won't believe the twist that went down in this other story popping up on your screen. Check it out right now.